I don't think I have to introduce myself. I was going to, but I think everyone here knows me. My name is Helen Hoffman. I work for Torah Umesorah as a Holocaust lecturer. Before that, I worked for the Museum of Jewish Heritage on their Speakers Bureau. I am passionate about educating young people about the Holocaust. After the war, it was not politically correct to discuss the Holocaust. Within the last 20 years, it has become the topic of conversation because, as you know, the survivors are diminishing. Those who lived through those horrific years are dying, and there are people today who are saying the Holocaust never happened. They're saying it from the United Nations Plaza. They're saying it from very, very important places. And you know what? There are people who are believing them. Before I begin with my presentation, why don't you come over here? Hi, good to
How are you?
I'd like to thank Chazaq for giving me this opportunity to speak to you tonight. I'd also like to thank L'chvod Achsanya, Rabbi and Rabbi Oelbam, for opening up the shul for us. I'm very grateful to be able to speak to you. Someone once, a friend of mine once asked me how I am, and I said great, and she said grateful. And I think it was a lesson for me because that's truthfully how I am. Before I begin, I'd like to read a poem that was written by my daughter, Brazy Gutman, who lives in Israel, and it really encompasses everything that I'm going to tell you tonight. The poem is entitled, Why Me? Why was I left alive? Why? God, Hashem, please explain. Not a single relative survived, yet I remain. I wasn't the type to fight or outsmart my plight, yet 6 million Jews were marched to the left and me to the right. My beautiful big sister Bruncha in smoke went up to the skies, her true identity mocked by her blonde hair and blue eyes. My baby brother Dudu, the child that I adored, pure with wide-eyed wonder, is no more. Why me? Why was I left to carry so much pain? Haunted by my memories, was my suffering in vain? Oh Hashem, please take notice what has sprung from all my guilt, the family I tenderly nurtured, the generations that I have built. Take pride in my existence. My tears do not condemn. My loved ones died for your honor, but I lived, Al Kiddush Hashem. I'm going to tell you a story about a little girl, a very special, carefree, happy, contented, wonderful little girl who lived in a small town in Poland called Gerardov. She lived there with her older sister Bruncha, her younger sister Henya, and her brothers, Leibel, Zalman, and David. She also, in her house, also lived her Babi Chaya Sarah, who she adored. Her Babi Chaya Sarah was her guardian angel. If things were not right, if she was unhappy, her Babi Chaya Sarah made everything good. But in 1939, all that changed. The Nazis came into her town, and all the horrors that she saw on the streets, the killing, the murders, everything that was so out in the open, the curfew. She was not able to go to school anymore. Her father was not able to go to work. Everything changed. She was not that happy, carefree little girl ever again. And that little girl was my mother. Her name was Ruzha Grizhak, and she was 11 years old. In 1941, my mother and her entire family were taken to the Warsaw Ghetto. The Warsaw Ghetto was a 16-block radius. You can imagine Kew Garden Hills, where at one point 500,000 Jews had to live. Thousands, tens of thousands of Jews died in the Warsaw Ghetto. My mother and her whole family were made to live in a one-room apartment. They shared with another family. My mother told me it was so awful. There was no food. There was no medical assistance. There was much hunger and disease. They got ration cards. My mother waited online every day for a loaf of bread, and that was her ration for the day. And if you lost your ration card, you would not be able to get that bread. You had to wear a yellow star, and if you were out after curfew, you were shot. My mother told me it was horrible, the suffering, the hunger. She said many times she would sneak through the legs of the guards, and she would go to the other towns in Poland, and there she would beg, or she would steal food, and she would bring it back to her family, thinking that possibly she was saving their lives by doing this. About a week when they were in the Warsaw Ghetto, her Babi Chayesara, her darling Babi Chayesara, decided she didn't want to live anymore. She said, I cannot tolerate this. I cannot watch my children and my grandchildren suffer so. And she sat down on the floor, and she closed her eyes, and Hashem took her neshama. My mother tells me that a Nazi guard came up, took her darling Babi Chayesara, undressed her, and threw her body out of the window into a waiting wagon. People died in the streets of the Warsaw Ghetto, and a wagon would pass by and take their bodies to a mass grave right outside of the Warsaw Ghetto. My great-grandmother was buried there. A number of years ago, I was fortunate enough to go with a seminary to Eastern Europe. And I was there at that mass grave, and I was able to say a kapitel Tillim for my great-grandmother. Things got progressively worse. My mother told me her father called her and her sister Bruncha and said, you must run away. You must try to save yourself. You must go to Zhechlin. Zhechlin was another town where her Babi Razel, her maternal grandmother, lived. It was not very far away, but they didn't know the way, and Bruncha and my mother started out. It took them 4 days to reach Zhechlin. They had to hide from the Germans as they were going. But when they reached Zhechlin, their Babi Razel was ecstatic to see them. She kissed them and she hugged them, but she cried because she knew of the matzav, she knew of the situation of her children. My mother slept in her Babi Razel's house, and her sister, Bruncha, slept by an aunt. One morning there was a knock on the door. It was a capo. A capo was a man or a woman, a Jewish man or woman that was taken by the Nazis to work for them. They were Jewish policemen. There were good capos who helped their brothers, and there were bad capos that wanted to find favor with the Nazis. But of course we know that never happened. And the capo said, I'm looking for Bruncha Grizhak. And my mother thought this was her opportunity to save her sister. She thought now she would be a hero. And so she said, she knew that if they came to take you, you were either going to a concentration camp, or to an Arbeitslager, a word camp, or to die. And she said, I'm Bruncha Grizhak. And they took her. What she didn't know was that she was going to live. She was going to survive. But her sister Bruncha died in Zhechlin when the Nazis came in and massacred every single Jew in Zhechlin. My mother was taken to an Arbeitslager, a work camp. It was called Palshilton. It was in Poland. She slept in a barn on a hayloft, and every morning she went out and worked the fields. It was very difficult. She got very little food. She came back late at night. Her body was bruised and tired, and she felt sometimes that she wouldn't be able to go on. But Hashem sent her a special message. She would have a reoccurring dream. In her dream, her Babi Chayesar would come to her. Her darling Babi Chayesar would say, Ruja, come, take my hand. And she would take her up to a shul, a beautiful white shul, which she said reminded her of her shul in Girardov. And she said, Ruja, look down. There are hundreds of men in Talesim, and they are davening. They are davening for you to live, and you will live. She felt this was a message. She felt that somehow Hashem was sending her a message that she was going to live. In 1943, my mother and 100 people that were in Palshilton were put on cattle cars. She says she has no idea how long they were there. They had to stand up. There was no room. There was no sanitary conditions. It could have been a day, or it could have been 4. But when that cattle car stopped, it stopped in a place called Auschwitz. And my mother said, everyone in that cattle car fell out. The living, the dead, and the sick. And my mother said that when she came to Auschwitz, the first thing she saw and the first thing she smelled was the smoke and the stench of the crematoriums. There were 4 crematoriums in Auschwitz that were daily burning thousands of Jews. Not just Jews, all people that were there. And when she came to Auschwitz, she came with her friend Sala. Sala was older than my mother and befriended her in Zhuchlin. She was like her protector. She watched over my mother in Palshilton. But when they came to Auschwitz, Sala contracted malaria, and my mother held her in her arms, and she watched her die. And she said, she told me, I was happy for her. I was happy that she wouldn't have to go through one more day of this horror. And you know what else she told me? I wished it was me. But that wasn't meant to be. My mother was meant to live. Every morning she would wake up and she would go to the Appellplatz. But before we talk about that, let's talk about what happened when she came to Auschwitz. When you came off that train, you either went to the left or you went to the right. If you went to the left, you were sent immediately to the crematorium to die. If you were sent to the right, you were possibly sent to work or to be checked, but you still had a chance to live. My mother went to the right. She was taken into a room. Her hair was shaved. Her clothes were taken away from her. And a number was put on her arm. A number was burned into her arm, tattooed on her arm. And the number was 57240. 57240. Add it up. It adds up to 18. Chai. And my mother said she thought this was a message from Hashem that she was going to live. And it was. Every morning she went to the Appellplatz, the meeting ground. And there she was given her job. She was a 15-year-old girl. She was given a heavy axe and she was sent out to a lake to break ice. The Nazis had an interesting way of dealing with young girls. My mother said it was so cold and the axe was so heavy that some days she couldn't do it. There were piles of bodies of people who had died from frost, from hunger, and she would go and she would lay down under the bodies. She would hide, and she would sleep. And then when they called her to go back to the Appellplatz, she would come out. And she told me that many days she saved her life like that, by doing that. One day, there was another selection on the Appellplatz. Young girls from the ages of 14 to 16 were chosen to work in the Union. The Union was an ammunition factory right outside of Auschwitz. And my mother was chosen to work there. She was thrilled. She'd be indoors. She'd get an extra bowl of soup, really dirty water, but at least she would not be cold anymore. And her job was to check the grenades. She sat at the Kindertisch, the children's table, girls between the ages of 14 and 16, and she would check the grenades. She had a box in front of her and had 3 separate parts, and she had a little key called a Laura, and she would check the grenade. If it was good, she would put it in the good box. If it was bad, in the bad, and if it could be fixed, in the middle box. One day, as she was sitting at the Kindertisch, a young man passed by. There were no men in the women's section. Auschwitz was a separate men's part and a separate women's part. There was a fence that separated them. But there were no cell phones, and there were no computers, and there was no way of getting messages from one camp to the other, except by messenger. And this young man, whose name was Salak Atlas, was a messenger. And he bent down and he said, "Are you Ruzha Grisha?" And she said yes. She couldn't believe that there was anyone that would know her. She was in shock. And he said, "There's a young man that works in the men's section who recognized you through the fence. He used to live in Jechlin, and he remembers that you used to come there with your parents for the Chagim. And he wants to help you. He has an amazing job. He works in the commissary. He takes care of all the food that comes in and goes out for the Germans. And he wants to help you. He wants to send you food. And he helps hundreds of people in Auschwitz and save their lives by sending them food." And the next week, this young man, whose name was Fulek Slatkin, sent my mother a hard-boiled egg. Can you imagine the way we relate to food, a hard-boiled egg? My mother said it was the most beautiful thing she ever saw. And the next week, he sent her a little orange. And the next week, a little small piece of chocolate. And every time he would send it with a note. And the note read, "You will survive. You will live. And after this war, we will be together." And my mother said the food was amazing. But the fact that there was somebody else in this world that cared about her and that cared that she would live, that's what gave her strength. That's what kept her going. One day, as she was sitting at the table, she was daydreaming. And by accident, she put a bad grenade into the good box. And when she brought it up to the German Meister, the Machshemam, he looked in and he said, "Sabotage! You will die. You will go out to the wagon. They will take you to the crematorium. You will die." My mother said she was shaking. Her knees were buckling. She was crying. She begged him. She said, "No, it was a mistake. I didn't mean it. It's not sabotage." He said, "No, go out and wait for the waiting car to take you to the crematorium." And she went outside, and as she was waiting, Salek, the messenger boy, saw her, and he said, "Why are you here?" And she told him. And he said, "The wagon isn't coming for a while. You wait right here." And he ran to the commissary, and I don't know if he stole or if he got a pack of cigarettes. And he went to the German Meister and he says, "I want you to put 57240 back on the roster." He said, "Why should I?" He said, "Because I'll give you a pack of cigarettes." I said, "Oh, okay." Ladies, for a pack of cigarettes, you could save a life. That was what a life was worth to these German animals. And so my mother went back inside, sat back at her table, and again, she saw the hand of God. She saw Hashem was keeping her alive. In the next room, in the Union, was a group of girls from the ages of 16 to 18. There were some very, very brave girls in there. Their job was to check the gunpowder. They sewed into their clothing a tiny, tiny little seam, and every day they would take out granules of gunpowder in that seam. And every day, 2, 3 granules, and they would give it to the underground. And one day when everyone was working, there was a big explosion. The largest crematorium in Auschwitz blew up. the underground had succeeded in fighting back. I know that many people think that they went like sheep to the slaughter, but it's not true. In the research that I've done, every concentration camp and almost every ghetto had an underground. They did try to fight back. They did try to fight the Germans. Well, of course, the Nazis wouldn't let this go by, and they found those 4 girls. And the next day on the Appellplatz, in front of the whole women's division, they hung them. Not one of those girls was older than 18. My mother said she was standing with the sister of one of the girls, and she was crying, but she said, "I'm so proud of her. I'm so proud of what she did and that she was able to fight back." In 1945, the war was basically over. The Allies had come in, but not in Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, they rounded everyone up, and they took them on the infamous Death March. My mother was one of those that went on the Death March. She said that sometimes she couldn't walk, so she pushed herself between 2 other women, and they would drag her along. They were passing by a town. They walked for 5 months in the coldest weather in Poland. They were passing by a town, and an old Polish woman came out, and she started screaming, "What are you doing to these children? They're skeletons." And the Nazi guard took his gun and shot her right in the head. My mother and a few of her friends hid under a bridge. A Polish man came and saw them and said, "What are you doing here?" And they said, "We're hiding from the Germans." "You're hiding from the Germans? The war is over. You were liberated." My mother told me she couldn't stand, she couldn't laugh, she couldn't cry. She was stuck to her seat because she didn't know what to do. And the Red Cross came and took her, and she was 2.5 months in the Red Cross in Prague, and they nursed her back to health. She said she doesn't know if she would have been able to survive without the Red Cross at that time. And when she was at the Red Cross, she saw a young man that she knew from Jechlin, and she said, "Do you know what happened to Fulek? Is Fulek alive?" And he said, "No, Fulek is dead." Fulek was on a train, and he jumped off, and the Nazis shot him. Fulek died. After all she'd gone through, this was something that she had to deal with. She lost her whole family. She knew that she lost everyone in the Warsaw Ghetto. In the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, her whole family was killed. And she had to be strong. And a young couple that were in the Red Cross with her said, "Let's go to Czechoslovakia. There's a place called Liberty in Czechoslovakia where they have a lot of young men and women are coming there. They're looking for husbands and wives. They're looking for family. Come with us. We're going there." And so my mother went. And when she got there, she was introduced to a very nice young man from a good family, nice looking. And they went out, they met, they liked each other, and they got married. And that was my father. After a few months, my father and my mother moved to a DP camp, displaced persons. The Germans were very nice. They gave the survivors a place to live free and clear. Wasn't that nice of them? And that was called a displaced persons camp. It was apartments, it was certain areas. And there was a displaced persons camp in Fehrenwald where my parents went to. And there something amazing happened. Something incredible. Something outstanding. I was born. Don't laugh. It was amazing. It was incredible. Last year in Florida, I met a woman who was there in Fehrenwald when I was born. You know who it is, Mrs. Berg. And she said, Chayela, I remember when you were born. They carried you from arm to arm to arm. And they said a miracle is born. After such a war, where the Nazis, Yamach Shemam, wanted to kill out every Jew, a Jewish child is born. I don't know if any of those survivors ever dreamed that they would have children, that they would have a normal life. And so, my parents moved to Munich, and it was Hanukkah, and my father was playing cards with his friends, my mother was making latkes in the kitchen, and this adorable baby girl was in her crib. And there was a knock at the door, and my mother thought, oh, probably another friend is coming to play cards. And she went to the door, and she opened it, and there was Fulek. And he said, you got married. You have a baby. You didn't wait for me. And she said, I thought you were killed. I thought you were dead. I found out that you were shot. And he says, yes, that's true. I jumped off a train. I was shot by the Germans, but the partisans that worked underground in the forests found me, nursed me back to health, and I was till the end of the war with the partisans. And my father came out, and anyone who knew my father, Zecher Levracha, he had the most amazing sense of humor, and he put his arm around Fulek and he said, you lucky guy. I got a wife and a baby. I'm stuck. You're a free man. Come on inside and play cards with us. And he did. In 1949, my parents wanted to move to Israel. You couldn't leave Germany. The Germans didn't want you, but they wouldn't let you leave. Unless you had a visa, and unless you had someone sign for you, you could not leave Germany. My parents had nobody in Israel, but in America, the Bava Rebbe was a relative, and he sent us papers, at that time for me, my younger brother, and my parents. And they traveled on a cargo ship for 2 weeks, and they came to America. This is a speech that I give to all the young people, and I tell them, you people know about this. You people understand what happened. That they came to this country, they had no language, they had no money, they had no family. And look what they produced. Look what they created. Children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren that were embedded in learning Torah and doing mitzvahs and creating a whole new era for the Jews. It is amazing to imagine that they had the strength and fortitude to do that. The kids that I speak to have no idea. And I tell them how lucky we are that we had someone to tell us what it was like. What's like to make a Shabbos. They didn't have anyone to tell them how to take care of their children. But somehow they persevered. Not only persevered, they were amazing. Why am I telling you this? Why am I so passionate about educating young people about the Holocaust? Because, as I told you, the generation is diminishing. We must never forget what happened only 70 years ago. Not thousands of years ago. 70 years ago. How we were tortured because we were Jewish. And if you look around you today, and if you read the headlines of what's going on, it's very similar. We feel insulated. We live in Kew Garden Hills. But we cannot feel insulated. We are Jews, not Americans. The Germans were Germans, not Jews. In 1938, in Evian, France, President Roosevelt called together 32 nations. They were to discuss the Jewish problem. What are we going to do with these Jews? Germany didn't want us. Nobody wanted us. So 32 nations were called together. How many nations did you think took in Jews after the Evian conference?
One.
How many?
One.
None. The Dominican Republic took in 600 Jews. They were not really part of that. This was a European council, but Dominican Republic took in 600 Jews. No European nation would take in Jews. They said they have quotas. They said they have every reason in the world. And you know what? This gave Germany impetus to start doing their horrific work. On November 9th, 1938, 76 years ago tomorrow, was the infamous night of broken glass, Kristallnacht. What happened in Germany and Austria? Soldiers, policemen came and destroyed, demolished, smashed over 200 shuls. 30,000 men were arrested and 90 were murdered that night. They took out the Sefer Torahs. They took out the sefarim and the sidurim. They burned them. They ripped them. They tore them. A whole night that was going on. They broke all the windows, and the broken glass was called Kristallnacht. The Germans, of course, did not take blame for this. They planned this for months before, but they blamed it on a young youth, a 17-year-old fellow, who couldn't take it anymore. And he went into the German embassy and he shot a German official. And they said, because of this, they started Kristallnacht. They say that Kristallnacht was the catalyst that started the Holocaust. Because I'm so involved in this and it's so important to me, I get a lot of emails. Last year I got an email from an organization that had Ben Brafman. I know you must have all heard of Ben Brafman. He's a very high state-of-the-art attorney. He is a second-generation survivor like I am, and he spoke at a Holocaust evening, and he said this speech. It was 48 pages, but I felt that you would not be interested in hearing all of it, so I just took out an excerpt. He said as follows: I did not survive. I was murdered at Auschwitz. My name is Yechiel Michael Friedman. I was murdered at Auschwitz. I did not die at Auschwitz. I was murdered at Auschwitz. None of you know me. None of the people in this room have ever met me. Not even my own grandson, Ben Brafman, who many of you know, has never met me. I have authorized my grandson to speak for me tonight. But this is not his speech. It's my speech. My grandson speaks for me because although I was murdered, I was not silenced. You must be reminded of my life and of my murder. Not my death, my murder. The murder of my family, of your family, of so many families. This is my story. A true story. A sad, horrific story. The world heard our screams, but did not care. The world smelled our burning flesh, but turned away. The world heard my Chayala screaming for her mother, and did nothing, because Chayala was a Jewish child, and at that time, the systematic murder of Jewish children, undertaken in an efficient, organized manner by monsters in government-issued uniform, was okay. Indeed, it was encouraged, applauded. The murderers were honored with medals, applauded as heroes for killing our children, for killing my grandchild, for killing my Chayala. Today, this morning, we read Parshas Vayira, and we learned about Abraham's Mesiras Nefesh for his connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How he had 10 tests, of course the last one was the Akedah, and how he surpassed all those tests because he wanted so much to have that connection with Hashem, in spite of everything. Those Jews that were in Auschwitz, Majdanek, and Treblinka, they had that connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They wanted that connection to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I'm told of stories where people hid tefillin, and at the risk of losing their lives, they would put those tefillin on in the morning and say a bracha. They didn't know if they were going to live another day, but they wanted that connection. There were those Jews that had a little light, and on Hanukkah, they would hide and they would light, and they would say the bracha over the Hanukkah lech, because they wanted that connection. And my mother told me that when she was in Auschwitz, on Pesach, she would trade her piece of bread, her lifeline, she would trade it for a potato or for something else, because they didn't want to eat chametz on Pesach. How amazing is that correlation with Avram Avinu and those people that wanted that connection to Hashem. So how do we connect to Hashem? What do we do to understand that connection? I say it's a dialogue. We have to speak to Hashem, and we have to know that everything that He does is for us, is for our own good. Every leaf that falls, every tear that flows, is because that's the way Hashem wanted it. A number of years ago, I was in Florida, and I heard Rabbi Gross. I don't know if anybody knows Rabbi Gross. He is the Rosh Kollel. And he said, tuning in and connecting to Hashem is like you're listening to a radio. You want to listen to a certain program on a radio, and you turn the dial to the left, and you turn the dial to the right, but you can't tune in. You can't get that station. It's going on, it's happening around you, but you can't tune in. You can't get on that connection. It's a very famous story. I mean, I'm sure you've all heard of it, but it's worth repeating again. This woman is in a parking lot, and she's driving around looking for a parking space. And she says, after 5 minutes looking for a parking space, Hashem, I need a parking spot. And just as she finishes the last word, somebody pulls out and says, never mind, Hashem, I got one by myself. That's not connecting. But we need to have a dialogue and be able to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. My mother would ask me why. Why me? Many of the survivors had guilt feelings. They felt guilty that they survived and not their parents and not their siblings. My mother would say, why me? Why was I left alive? And of course I would say, because you had to have me. But that's not the reason. The reason was because it was Hashgacha Pratis that my mother was going to live. She was handpicked by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to live, to survive. My mother spoke every day. She would tell me stories about the camps, about her friends, but what she spoke about most of all was her family, how much she missed them. She would sing me songs that her mother sang her when she was a little girl. She had an amazing memory. She would always talk about how she loved her brothers and sisters and how much she missed them and how much she missed not being part of the family. And when she was nifta 9 years ago, I was in the hospital, and my daughter was here from Israel, and she came in and she said, what an amazing reunion this is going to be. I'd like to end with a happy note, because there is a happy ending here. I'm a bubby, and we all know we bubbies love to talk about our grandchildren. So I'm going to torment you with another story about my grandchild. I have a grandson who lives in Muncie. His name is Daniel. And about a year ago, he called me on the phone. He said, Bubby, pack a suitcase. Mashiach is coming tomorrow. I said, Daniel, how do you know that? He said, I know Mashiach is coming tomorrow. Mommy has a suitcase packed. Tati has a suitcase packed. He is one of 7 brothers and 2 sisters. He said everyone had to have a suitcase packed. He was about 7 years old, 7 or 8 years old. And of course, we all know that Mashiach did not come the next morning. And I was so upset. I said, what are they going to tell Daniel? I mean, he was so sure. So I called my daughter-in-law, Esty, and I said, Esty, what happened when Mashiach didn't come? And she said, the night before, my son David went over and said, Daniel, I know Mashiach is going to come. He might not come tomorrow, but he's on the way. He might be delayed, he might be detained, but he's on the way. So I want to leave you with that message. I know he's coming. I know he's on the way, and we should all be zeicher to see him here very soon. Amen. Thank you for listening. If there are any questions, if anybody has any questions about anything that I said, yes?
Can you tell the story of Fuller years later? You know, so your mother passed away, it'll be 10 years, but let's say a few years before then, what happened?
Well, this is my sister-in-law, Pesci. This is a very warm crowd, cozy. We were very fortunate to meet Fulek again.
But through whom? Do you remember through whom? Your mother had a friend also that she found?
In Florida.
That friend found your mother in Florida.
Right. Okay, but Fulek came, we met Fulek because we gave a Sefer Torah, my brother gave a Sefer Torah in honor of my father, and Fulek came to the Achnasa Sefer Torah. And we were able to meet him. And he married a woman in Toronto, and he had 2 sons, and he was such a wonderful, kind person. And he saved hundreds of people in Auschwitz with a little bit of food that he was able to sneak out.
But when I was in Florida, just to let everybody know if they're interested, we got the chance to meet him, like I'm sure you did. But when we met him, we went for Purim, and we had the Purim Suda together downstairs in the tower. And he had a wonderful, wonderful wife. He subsequently passed away shortly after. He was a healthy man, but he died suddenly, unfortunately. I think maybe a year or 2 after my mother-in-law met him. But he still looked so lovingly at my mother-in-law. I'll never forget it.
I didn't notice that. Only a daughter-in-law would notice that, not a daughter.
We spent quite a bit of time. So they did have another reunion of sorts.
Are there any questions? Go ahead.
How is it that your mother was able to talk about her experiences when there are so many people?
Isn't that amazing? My father never said a word. Do you know, my father would, if somebody came into the house, and many times friends came in, people that were together with them, and they would start talking about the war, my father would walk out. He could not deal with it. And I knew nothing about my father during the war until after he passed away. My mother spoke every day. She spoke to my children.
Every day.
She would always tell us, oh, this happened here and that. Oh, everything reminded her about something. I grew up, Friday night, my father would take my brothers to shul. My mother would tell me what happened in the camp. So I grew up knowing everything my mother. She needed to talk. She needed to talk. She was that type of person that she needed to talk. Are there any questions? Any other questions?
My parents never spoke a word. And I have an uncle who survived the war, my mother's brother. He was 16 years old, and he's the only one who survived in the family. And I beg him, tell me something. So what happens? I get English.
You should know that it's really important that if anyone knows a survivor or has a survivor, they should talk to them. They should try for them to tell them. Every survivor story is my mother's is a miracle. Every story of every survivor.
You didn't bring any books?
I didn't bring any books, no.
Oh, I read the book of Raising.
Yeah.
What book?
I have a book of everything that I said and more. My daughter wrote it, yeah. If you're interested, you can pass by my house, I'll give it to you. I take it with me when I go to the schools. I drop it off at the schools. Yeah.
Branded for life.
Yes, branded for life, yeah. Anybody else? Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you.